The steel arrived in sections, 3 stories tall, welded together in shops far from Manhattan. Each piece weighed several tons. Workers bolted them to the tower as it climbed 2 stories per week, sometimes 3. By December 1970, people were moving into the North Tower while welders still worked 60 floors above them. The building was not finished, it was occupied. On the 107th floor, someone had already ordered furniture for an office that did not yet have walls, in a tower that would not be completed for another 2 years. What do you call a place that people live inside before it is ready to hold them? Construction began with subtraction. On August 5, 1960, crews started dismantling Radio Row, a neighborhood of more than 300 small businesses selling vacuum tubes, transistor radios, and war-surplus electronics. The shops had been there since the 1920s. Oscar Nadale, who ran Oscar's Radio on Cortlandt Street, led the legal fight against the Port Authority's eminent domain claim. He lost. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case in November 1963. Each business owner received $3,000, regardless of how long they had operated or how profitable they were. Some relocated to Canal Street, most simply closed. The excavation itself became an engineering problem wrapped inside a political one. The site sat on landfill that had been added to Manhattan's western edge over centuries. To build towers this tall, the foundations had to reach bedrock, 70 feet below street level. Workers dug a trench 3 feet wide and 3,500 feet long around the perimeter, filling it with a slurry of water and bentonite clay to prevent the walls from collapsing inward. Then they poured concrete into the slurry, creating what engineers called the bathtub, an enormous underground box that would keep the Hudson River from flooding the site. 1.2 million cubic yards of earth came out of the ground. The material had to go somewhere. Rather than paying to barge it out to sea or truck it to New Jersey landfills, the Port Authority made a deal. They would dump it along the Hudson shoreline just north of the site. 23.5 acres of new land appeared. Eventually, this landfill would become Battery Park City, a separate neighborhood of office towers and apartments. The World Trade Center created its own adjacent real estate before the first tower even existed. 3,500 workers cycled through the site at peak construction. 60 of them died. Some fell, some were crushed by equipment. Some died in accidents that were never fully explained in the sparse records the Port Authority maintained. The names of these workers do not appear on any memorial. Their deaths were filed as construction incidents, an expected cost of building at this scale and speed. Insurance covered them. Work continued. The twin tower design came from necessity, not symbolism. Minoru Yamasaki, the architect selected in September 1962, initially proposed 80-story towers. The Port Authority insisted on 10 million square feet of office space. That requirement forced the buildings taller. Yamasaki tested different configurations: 1 enormous tower, 4 medium towers, 3 towers, 2 towers. The 2-tower plan won because elevators made anything else impractical. Above 80 stories, you needed so many elevator shafts that you lost most of your rentable space. Yamasaki's solution was an express and local system borrowed from the subway. Elevators would shoot up to sky lobbies on the 44th and 78th floors, where passengers would transfer to local elevators. This innovation meant each tower could rise to 110 stories while maintaining vast, column-free floors, nearly an acre per floor. The structural system was equally radical. Instead of supporting the buildings with internal columns, the engineers moved the strength to the exterior walls. 236 steel columns on each building's perimeter, spaced just 22 inches apart, created a rigid tube that could handle wind loads and the building's enormous weight. The core contained elevators, stairs, and utilities. Everything in between was open. David Rockefeller had wanted this project for nearly a decade by the time ground broke. His family's bank, Chase Manhattan, had built a new headquarters downtown in 1960, but the financial district was dying. Businesses were moving to Midtown. The ports were declining. Lower Manhattan felt cramped, dirty, outdated. In 1958, Rockefeller founded the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association and commissioned a study from McKinsey & Company on whether a World Trade Center made economic sense. McKinsey's report was blunt. It probably would not work. The firms that needed to coordinate international trade already had those services available elsewhere. There was no reason to consolidate them, and building downtown, where everyone was leaving, seemed especially unwise. Rockefeller ignored the report. He hired a different firm to draw up plans. The project needed a sponsor with enough power and money to override normal city regulations, so Rockefeller approached the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a bi-state agency that ran bridges, tunnels, airports, and the declining Hudson Tubes commuter railroad. The Port Authority had revenues from tolls and the ability to issue bonds without voter approval. It also was not subject to New York City building codes. The location was initially planned for the east side, near the South Street seaport. But New Jersey's governor objected. Why should his state help pay for something that only benefited Manhattan? The deal nearly collapsed until someone suggested moving the site to the west side, directly above the Port Authority's failing Hudson terminal. New Jersey agreed, on the condition that the Port Authority take over the bankrupt Hudson and Manhattan Railroad and rebuild it as PATH. This political compromise determined where the towers would stand. Construction began officially in August 1966, but the towers did not start rising until August 1968 for the North Tower and January 1968 for the South. Prefabricated components arrived by truck, 3-column sections each 3 stories tall, already welded together. Cranes lifted them into place. Bolts connected them. The speed was unprecedented. When the North Tower topped out on December 23, 1970, tenants were already moving into lower floors. The building was renting space while still under construction. The South Tower topped out in July 1971. The official ribbon-cutting ceremony happened on April 4, 1973. By then, the final cost had reached $900 million, more than triple the original estimate of $280 million. The Port Authority absorbed the overruns by raising tolls on its bridges and tunnels. Drivers crossing from New Jersey into New York were, in effect, subsidizing the towers whether they ever set foot in them or not. The towers opened into a recession with no tenants waiting. In 1973, when the ribbon was cut, only 111 tenants occupied space across both towers, employing just 1,800 people combined. The Port Authority had promised 10 million square feet of leasable office space, more than all of downtown Los Angeles, Detroit, or Houston had at the time. But Lower Manhattan already had a glut of empty offices. The towers did not create new demand. They redistributed existing tenants from older buildings nearby, driving up vacancy rates across the financial district. Private developers filed lawsuits. Lawrence Wien, owner of the Empire State Building, led the Committee for a Reasonable World Trade Center, arguing that subsidized government office space competing with private landlords violated free market principles. The Port Authority countered that the towers served a public purpose, facilitating international trade. But the agency's own internal memos revealed doubt. Almost no firms involved in actual trade, shipping companies, customs brokers, freight forwarders, wanted space in the towers. The rents were too high, and the location was inconvenient to the ports, which were mostly in Brooklyn and New Jersey now. The Port Authority responded by moving its own headquarters into the North Tower and leasing space to itself. New York state agencies followed, taking floors at below-market rates. The initial tenant list read like a government directory. The U.S. SEC did. Customs Service occupied all of 6 World Trade Center, an 8-story building in the complex. This was strategic. By filling space with government agencies, the Port Authority could claim occupancy while avoiding the embarrassment of empty towers. To attract private tenants, the agency offered subsidies. Rents in the World Trade Center ran cheaper than comparable space elsewhere in Manhattan because the Port Authority drew on its bridge and tunnel revenues to cover operating losses. This arrangement infuriated private landlords, who could not compete with a government agency willing to lose money indefinitely. It also created a perverse incentive. The cheaper the Port Authority made the rent, the more it had to raise tolls elsewhere in its system. Architectural critics hated the towers. Ada Louise Huxtable of the New York Times called them the world's daintiest architecture for the world's biggest buildings. Louis Mumford dismissed them as just glass and metal filing cabinets. Jane Jacobs, the urbanist, condemned the entire project as vandalism against Lower Manhattan's organic street life. The towers created a superblock, closing 5 streets and interrupting the grid. The plaza was windswept and empty. The complex turned inward, with its underground shopping mall drawing foot traffic away from street-level businesses in the surrounding blocks. The tower's narrow windows, just 18 inches wide, came from Yamasaki's fear of heights. He wanted occupants to feel secure. Instead, people complained the windows made the buildings feel claustrophobic. Office workers called them the filing cabinets. Critics noted the irony. The world's tallest buildings, designed to inspire awe, made people feel trapped. Still, the towers gradually filled. By 1975, the North Tower reached 75% occupancy, with average rents at $6 per square foot. Financial and business service firms began moving in during the 1980s, attracted by the cheap rent and the column-free floors, which were ideal for trading desks. The observation deck on the South Tower's 107th floor became a tourist attraction, drawing visitors who wanted to see 45 miles in any direction on clear days. Windows on the World, the restaurant atop the North Tower, opened in 1976 and became a symbol of Manhattan luxury. But the vacancy problem persisted. The complex did not achieve 95% occupancy until mid-2001, 28 years after opening. For decades, the towers represented a financial albatross for the Port Authority, which kept them viable only by subsidizing rents with revenue from unrelated infrastructure. The towers were never a commercial success in conventional terms. They survived because a government agency was willing to operate them at a loss. In 1998, the Port Authority decided to privatize. It sought bids for a 99-year lease. The goal was to get the towers off the agency's books and back onto the city's tax rolls. After a lengthy competition, the Port Authority selected Silverstein Properties in July 2001. The lease was valued at $3.25 billion. Silverstein signed the papers in late July. 6 weeks later, the towers were gone. Radio Row had been a tinker's paradise, a 9-block district where you could buy any electronic component imaginable, haggle over prices, and find parts salvaged from military surplus. The neighborhood centered on Cortlandt Street, where Harry Schneck opened City Radio in 1921. Other shops followed. By the 1960s, the area held more than 300 businesses selling vacuum tubes, transistors, wire, capacitors, amateur radio equipment, and televisions. The shops were cramped and chaotic, with inventory spilling onto sidewalks. Collectors and engineers came from across the region. The district had its own ecology. Hobbyists bought components. Technicians repaired equipment. Wholesalers supplied retailers, and everyone knew everyone else. When the Port Authority announced plans to demolish Radio Row for the World Trade Center, the merchants formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association to fight back. Oscar Nadale, known as the King of Cortlandt Street, became their spokesman. He requested a meeting with Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's executive director. When it finally happened in June 1962, Tobin offered Nadale a consolation, a storefront in the new World Trade Center complex once it was built. Nadale rejected the offer immediately. His business depended on being surrounded by similar businesses. One isolated shop in a government office complex would fail. 2 weeks later, a group representing approximately 325 shops and 1,000 other affected small businesses filed an injunction challenging the Port Authority's power of eminent domain. The case wound through the court system. Lower courts repeatedly ruled that the World Trade Center did not serve a public purpose and that the Port Authority's claims about facilitating trade were pretextual. But the New York State Court of Appeals reversed those decisions. The judges held that the Port Authority, as a bi-state public agency, had broad discretion to define public purpose. The merchants appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In November 1963, the court declined to hear the case. The Port Authority began purchasing properties in March 1965. Demolition started in March 1966. Each business received $3,000 in compensation, regardless of how long it had operated, how many employees it had, or how much revenue it generated. A shop that had been there for 40 years received the same amount as one that opened 6 months earlier. Some owners tried to relocate. Canal Street, a few blocks north, absorbed some of the businesses. But most could not afford to restart elsewhere. The $3,000 barely covered moving costs, and finding a new location in Manhattan was expensive. Many merchants simply closed and walked away. In protest, The Radio Row merchants carried a coffin through the streets, symbolizing the death of Mr. Small Businessman. The media covered the march. It changed nothing. By the end of 1966, Radio Row was gone. The Port Authority demolished 164 buildings to clear the 16-acre site. Approximately 100 residents also lived in the area, people who rented apartments above the shops. They were displaced along with the businesses, receiving similar minimal compensation. The legal precedent was significant. The Supreme Court's refusal to hear the Radio Row case strengthened the doctrine that government agencies could use eminent domain for economic redevelopment, not just traditional public uses like roads or schools. Later cases would cite Radio Row when approving the seizure of private property to transfer it to other private developers. The neighborhood's destruction became a template for urban renewal projects across the country. Years later, some of the displaced merchants would note the irony. The Port Authority claimed it needed to demolish Radio Row to build a World Trade Center that would facilitate international commerce, but Radio Row itself had been an international commerce hub. Electronics dealers imported components from Japan, Germany, and England. Wholesalers exported equipment to buyers in South America and Europe. The neighborhood was already doing what the Port Authority claimed only the towers could do. The difference was that Radio Row did it without government subsidy, in old buildings that generated tax revenue for the city. By 1973, when the towers opened, most former Radio Row merchants had disappeared into other lines of work or retirement. A few maintained connections and held informal reunions. They would gather and talk about Cortlandt Street as it used to be, the clutter, the haggling, the smell of solder and old electronics. Some visited the towers and walked through the underground mall, trying to orient themselves to where their shops once stood. But the street grid was gone, demolished to create the superblock. There were no landmarks left to navigate by. The place they remembered had been erased not just physically but cartographically. The streets themselves no longer existed on maps. 200,000 tons of steel went into the towers, 425,000 cubic yards of concrete, 43,600 windows containing 572,000 square feet of glass, 1,143,000 square feet of aluminum sheet wrapped the exterior, 12,000 miles of electrical cable threaded through the walls and floors, enough to run from New York to Tokyo and back. The towers required 198 elevators operating inside 15 miles of elevator shafts. At the time of installation, the elevator motors were the largest in the world. Each tower consumed as much electricity as a city of 100,000 people. The air conditioning system moved enough air to fill the Empire State Building every 7 minutes. 20 different food and drink vendors operated in the complex, capable of feeding 150,000 people each day. Each floor measured approximately 40,000 square feet, nearly an acre of uninterrupted space. Multiply that by 110 stories per tower, subtract the mechanical floors and sky lobbies, and you arrive at roughly 10 million square feet of rentable office space across both buildings. When fully occupied, the towers could house 50,000 workers. On a typical day in 2001, approximately 58,000 people passed through the complex. Workers, visitors, tourists, commuters using the PATH station underneath. The construction timeline compressed impossibly. Ground broke in August 1966, the North Tower topped out in December 1970, the South Tower in July 1971. That meant the North Tower rose 110 stories in less than 4 years and 3 months, averaging about 2 stories per week. The speed was possible only because of prefabrication. Each 3-column, 3-story module arrived at the site already welded together. Cranes lifted them into place. Workers bolted them to the sections below. The perimeter took shape like a puzzle assembling itself vertically. 3,500 people worked on site during peak construction periods. A total of 10,000 people contributed labor to the project over its lifespan. 60 workers died during construction. Crushed, fallen, struck by equipment, or killed in ways the sparse records do not fully explain. The death rate was lower than typical for projects of this scale in that era, but the absolute number remained. 60 men did not come home. Their families received payments through workers' compensation insurance. The Port Authority did not track their names in any central memorial or public record. The cost numbers told their own story. Initial estimate in 1962, $280 million. Revised estimate in 1964, $525 million. Final cost when the towers opened in 1973, $900 million. In 2025 dollars, adjusting for inflation, that $900 million becomes approximately $7 billion. The Port Authority paid for the overruns by issuing bonds backed by its toll revenues. Every driver paying to cross the George Washington Bridge or the Lincoln Tunnel was servicing debt on towers they might never enter. The vacancy rates quantified the commercial failure. In late 1971, before the towers officially opened, they had 111 tenants employing 1,800 people combined. By 1975, the North Tower reached 75% occupancy. The South Tower lagged behind. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, both towers hovered between 70 and 85% occupied. Not until mid-2001, 28 years after opening, did the complex achieve 95% occupancy. For comparison, a successful commercial office building typically reaches 90% occupancy within 2 to 3 years. The subsidy numbers were harder to track because the Port Authority did not break them out explicitly, but independent analyses estimated that the agency kept rents below market rates by roughly 15 to 20% throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. These subsidies came directly from bridge and tunnel revenues. In effect, the Port Authority was transferring wealth from New Jersey commuters to Manhattan office tenants. The arrangement was legal but generated persistent resentment from New Jersey politicians and private landlords who competed with subsidized rents. On February 26, 1993, shortly after noon, Ramzi Youssef and Ayad Ismail drove a yellow Ryder rental van into the public parking garage beneath the North Tower. They parked on the B2 level, 2 floors below ground. Youssef ignited a 20-foot fuse. Both men fled. 12 minutes later, at 12:18 p.m., the bomb exploded. The device contained approximately 1,310 pounds of urea nitrate mixed with aluminum, magnesium, and ferric oxide particles. 3 tanks of compressed hydrogen gas surrounded the main charge, designed to amplify the fireball and create a fuel-air explosion. The blast generated an estimated pressure of 150,000 pounds per square inch. It carved a crater nearly 100 feet wide, punching through 4 levels of concrete. 6 people died almost instantly. Monica Rodriguez-Smith, a secretary, was 7 months pregnant. Robert Kirkpatrick, a security officer, was making his rounds. Stephen Knapp, a maintenance worker, was checking equipment. John DiGiovanni was having lunch in the garage-level cafeteria. William Macco, another maintenance worker, was near the parking area. Wilfredo Mercado, a receiving agent, was processing deliveries. All 6 were killed by the initial blast or the structural collapse that followed immediately after. More than 1,000 people were injured. Most suffered smoke inhalation as toxic fumes poured up through elevator shafts and stairwells. The explosion severed the main electrical feeders, plunging both towers into darkness. Emergency lighting failed in many areas. Smoke detectors did not function because power was out. The towers had no sprinkler systems at that time, a decision made during construction to save money. Approximately 50,000 people were in the complex that day. They had to evacuate down darkened stairwells filled with smoke. The evacuation took hours. Some people were trapped in elevators between floors, waiting in darkness while rescue workers manually opened doors and helped them down. Others walked down from the 110th floor, a descent that took 2 hours for those in good health and much longer for anyone with mobility issues. Pregnant women, elderly visitors, people with disabilities, all had to navigate the stairs in near-total darkness, breathing smoke, uncertain whether the building might collapse at any moment. The bomber's intention had been far more catastrophic. Youssef later told investigators he had hoped the blast would topple the North Tower into the South Tower, bringing both down and killing tens of thousands of people. The plan failed because he miscalculated the structural resilience of the towers. The bomb destroyed the immediate area around it, but did not compromise the core columns that held the towers upright. The buildings remained standing. The FBI investigation moved quickly. Within days, agents traced the vehicle identification number from a piece of the van's chassis found in the rubble. The van had been rented by Mohammed Salome, who made the fatal mistake of returning to the rental agency to claim his $400 deposit. An FBI SWAT team arrested him on March 4th. One clue led to another. Nidal Ayad, Mahmoud Abu Halima, Ahmed Ajaj. By mid-March, investigators had found the apartment where the bomb was built and a storage locker containing enough cyanide gas to kill everyone in a sealed building. Yusuf himself escaped. He flew to Pakistan the night of the bombing. It took nearly 2 years to find him. In February 1995, a man walked into a U.S. diplomat's residence in Karachi claiming to know Yusuf's location. The informant was legitimate, a former associate. On February 7, 1995, Pakistani law enforcement and diplomatic security service agents raided Yusuf's hotel room and arrested him. He was flown back to New York for trial. The informant received a $2 million reward. In the wake of the bombing, the Port Authority and tenant companies revised emergency procedures. The towers installed new sprinkler systems, upgraded emergency lighting, improved communication systems, and conducted regular evacuation drills. The Port Authority took over as the main security authority for the complex. Vehicle access to the parking garage was restricted. Concrete barriers went up around the perimeter. Security checkpoints screened deliveries. The bombing left psychological scars. Many people who worked in the towers developed anxiety about being trapped. Some requested office space on lower floors. Others left for jobs elsewhere. The towers had been attacked, had been shown to be vulnerable, and everyone who worked there now knew it. The question was not whether the buildings could be attacked. That had been answered. The question was whether they could withstand another attempt and whether the new security measures would be enough. A granite memorial fountain was installed on the Austin J. home. Tobin Plaza, in 1995, directly above the blast site. It listed the names of the 6 dead in both English and Spanish. The fountain would be destroyed 8 years later, on September 11, 2001, when the towers themselves came down. A fragment of the fountain bearing part of John Giovanni's name was later recovered from the rubble and incorporated into a temporary memorial. By the 1990s, the towers had become something they were never designed to be: symbols. They appeared in films as shorthand for New York itself. The opening shot of a movie would pan across the skyline, and there they were, twin verticals, unmistakable, modern, American. They showed up in Superman, in Escape from New York, in Working Girl, in Home Alone 2. Directors used them to establish location and era. If you saw the towers, you knew, this is New York. This is now. This is the late 20th century. By one count, the towers appeared in 472 films before 2001. Tourists bought postcards featuring the towers, snow globes, keychains, miniature replicas. The towers adorned T-shirts, coffee mugs, posters, calendars. They became totemic objects, representations of the city divorced from their original purpose as office buildings. Most tourists who bought tower memorabilia never went inside. They photographed them from Battery Park or from boats in the harbor. The towers existed in the popular imagination as facades, as silhouettes, as shapes against the sky. For people who worked there, the towers were something else entirely, a place you went every day, complained about, took for granted. The elevators were slow during rush hour. The bathrooms needed updating. The plaza was cold and windy. The narrow windows made some offices feel claustrophobic. It was a job site, with all the mundane irritations of any large office building. The grandeur that tourists saw from a distance collapsed into ordinary frustrations up close. The observation deck on the South Tower's 107th floor drew millions of visitors. On a clear day, you could see 45 miles in every direction. People proposed marriage there. School groups took field trips. Tourists from every country lined up to ride the elevators. The deck generated significant revenue for the Port Authority, one of the few aspects of the towers that turned a reliable profit. The experience was carefully managed. Timed tickets, security screening, gift shop at the exit. It was a tourist attraction engineered for maximum throughput. Windows on the world, the restaurant complex atop the North Tower occupied the 106th and 107th floors. It opened in 1976 and quickly became one of the city's premier dining destinations. The restaurant employed approximately 450 people who spoke more than 60 different languages. It operated multiple venues: the main dining room, Wild Blue, a contemporary American restaurant, and the greatest bar on earth. Windows on the World also ran a wine school, hosting classes and tastings. The views were spectacular: floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Manhattan, Brooklyn, New Jersey, the harbor. On September 11, 2001, the restaurant was hosting a conference for Risk Waters Group. Everyone in Windows on the World that morning died. The towers also functioned as a vertical city with its own infrastructure. The underground mall contained shops and restaurants serving the daily needs of 50,000 workers. Multiple banks had branches in the complex. There were post offices, newsstands, hair salons, shoe repair shops. The PATH station underneath connected to trains heading to New Jersey, making the towers a major commuting hub. On any given weekday, the complex processed more foot traffic than many small cities see in a month. Philippe Petit, the French high-wire artist, walked between the towers on August 7, 1977 to 4. He strung a cable 131 feet long between the roofs, 1,350 feet above the plaza. He crossed 8 times in 45 minutes, performing for the crowds gathering below. Police arrested him when he finally came down. The Port Authority dropped the charges in exchange for Petit performing for children in Central Park. His walk became legendary, an act of unauthorized beauty, a human body suspended between 2 massive structures, grace against geometry. People parachuted off the towers illegally. Owen Quinn jumped from the North Tower in July 1975. At least 4 others followed between 1980 and 1999. George Willig scaled the South Tower's exterior on May 26, 1970, earning the nickname the Human Fly. These stunts were criminal trespasses, but they captured something about the towers. They invited transgression, dared people to test themselves against the building's scale and height. The towers were monuments, but they were also challenges. By 2001, the towers had become too familiar to really see. New Yorkers stopped noticing them the way you stop noticing anything you pass every day. They were just there, part of the landscape, unremarkable in their ubiquity. Only visitors looked up. Only tourists took pictures. For everyone else, the towers were background, context, a known quantity. They would always be there, the way the sun would always rise. That was the assumption. The towers had survived 1 bombing. Security had been upgraded. What else could happen? In 1930, 2 economists named William Clark and John Kingston published a book titled The Skyscraper, a study of its economic height. They modeled a hypothetical office tower on a large lot near Grand Central Terminal and calculated the profit-maximizing height using detailed cost and revenue projections. Their conclusion: 67 stories would yield the best return on investment. 75 stories was a close second. Anything taller than that reduced profitability because construction costs increased faster than rental income. The Empire State Building had 102 stories. Clark and Kingston's model assumed stable economic conditions, reasonable occupancy rates, and rational tenant demand. When those assumptions held, the math was clear. There was an optimal height for any given lot, and exceeding that height meant building floors that would cost more to construct and maintain than they would ever generate in rent. The Empire State Building had exceeded optimal height by approximately 30 stories. This was before accounting for the Depression. The building's initial revenue projections, developed by Raskob and Smith in 1929, assumed they could charge an average of $3.37 per square foot annually for office space. This was slightly below what comparable buildings near Grand Central were charging, but the Empire State Building was farther from mass transit hubs. The projection seemed reasonable. At full occupancy, the building would generate approximately $9,400,000 in gross annual rent. Against that, construction costs of $40,948,900 plus the land purchase of $16 million. Total investment, approximately $57 million. Add the $27 million loan from Metropolitan Life at interest rates that were never publicly disclosed but likely around 5%. Annual interest alone would exceed $1 million. The building needed to maintain high occupancy just to service the debt. It needed near full occupancy to generate profit. Instead, in the first year, it achieved 23% occupancy. The math became simple. The building could not generate enough revenue to cover its costs. This was not a short-term problem. This was structural insolvency. Metropolitan Life renegotiated the loan terms in the mid-1930s. The exact details remain unclear. Private negotiations, confidential agreements, but the effect was obvious. Payments were reduced, timelines extended, interest rates adjusted. MetLife understood that foreclosing would not improve their position. They would own a building that was losing money and had no obvious path to profitability. Better to keep the loan on the books, accept reduced payments, and hope the economy recovered. Pierre DuPont, Raskob's longtime friend and one of the building's primary backers, moved his offices into the building in the mid-1930s. This was described in some accounts as charity, in others as strategy. DuPont did not need office space in the Empire State Building. He had offices elsewhere. But his presence as a tenant created the appearance of confidence. If one of the richest men in America was willing to rent space in the building, perhaps it was not failing as badly as it appeared. The city of New York also renegotiated. Property taxes on the building were substantial. The exact figures varied year to year, but estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The city had no interest in forcing the building into bankruptcy. An empty building generated no tax revenue. A building with reduced occupancy generating reduced tax revenue was better than nothing. So the city lowered the assessment, extended payment timelines, worked with the owners to keep the building operational. These negotiations were not publicized. They happened in private meetings between lawyers, accountants, city officials. The public saw the empty state building. Behind that, a network of compromises, deferrals, accommodations. Everyone involved had an interest in keeping the building from total collapse. MetLife needed to protect their loan. The city needed tax revenue. DuPont needed to protect his investment. Smith and Raskob needed to avoid the humiliation of outright failure, so the building continued. Not thriving, not profitable. Just continuing. By 1940, occupancy had improved slightly. Some sources suggest 40%. Others claim the building reached 98% occupancy by the mid-1940s. The discrepancy in these figures is significant and unresolved. Official records from this period are incomplete or contradictory. What seems clear, the building did not become consistently profitable until after World War II, when the economy recovered and office space in Manhattan became scarce. The war changed the equation. Government agencies needed space. Military contractors needed offices. War relief organizations needed headquarters. By 1945, the building had tenants. Not because it was well located or well priced, but because demand finally exceeded supply. The glut of the 1930s became a shortage in the 1940s. The building survived not because it was a good investment, but because the economy eventually caught up to its capacity. In 1950, the building broke even for the first time, 19 years after opening. 19 years of losses, negotiations, compromises. John Raskob died that same year. He had never seen the building become profitable. Al Smith had died in 1944, also before profitability. The men who built the building did not live to see it succeed. Raskob's estate listed the building for sale in 1951 with a minimum asking price of $50 million. A syndicate led by business partners Roger Stevens, Henry Crown, Alfred Glancy, and Ben Tobin purchased it for $50 million. At the time, this was the highest price ever paid for a single structure. The sale was brokered by the Charles F. Noyes Company. The transaction made news not because the building was profitable, it had just broken even, but because someone was willing to pay that much for it. Stevens explained the purchase bluntly. "We didn't buy it because it's the world's tallest building, but because it looked like a cheap piece of real estate." This was not a vote of confidence in the building's design or prestige. King Kong climbed the Empire State Building in 1933. The film was released 2 years after the building opened, and it gave the structure something commercial tenants had not: a narrative. The giant ape, captured and brought to New York, breaks free during a theatrical exhibition, kidnaps a woman, and climbs the tallest building in the world while biplanes circle and fire machine guns. Kong swats planes from the sky. He holds the woman, Ann Darrow, played by Fay Wray, in one massive hand while gripping the building's spire with the other. Eventually, he is shot down. He falls. The building remains. The film was fiction, but the building was real, and audiences could visit the exact location where Kong had made his stand. The observation deck became a pilgrimage site. People paid their dollar, rode the elevator, stood where Kong had stood, or where he would have stood if he had existed. The line between fiction and tourism dissolved. The building became famous not for its tenants but for a movie about a creature that never lived. This was the observation deck's function, to convert altitude into revenue. $1 per visitor, 1 million visitors in the first year. $2 million. The observation deck made as much money as all the office rent combined, and it did so by offering something offices could not: a story. The building appeared in films, photographs, postcards, advertisements. It became a symbol of New York, which meant it became a symbol of modernity itself. The image was everywhere. The reality, 75% vacant, losing money, was irrelevant to the image. The building existed in two registers simultaneously, as a failing commercial property and as a global icon. The marketing team understood this. They advertised the observation deck aggressively. They placed ads in newspapers, on train tickets, in tourist brochures. They emphasized the view. 80 miles on a clear day, they emphasized the height. 1,050 feet to the 86th floor observatory. They did not emphasize that most of the building below was empty. In 1939, the romantic drama Love Affair featured the Empire State Building as a meeting point. The plot: a couple agrees to meet at the top of the building in 6 months if they still love each other. An accident prevents the meeting. The tragedy unfolds. The building is the stage. In 1957, the film was remade as An Affair to Remember with Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr. Same plot, same building. The observation deck became synonymous with romance, fate, missed chances. Sleepless in Seattle in 1993 used the same device. So did countless other films, television shows, novels. The building was no longer just a structure. It was a cultural artifact, a setting where narratives unfolded. People proposed marriage there. People scattered ashes there. People came to see the city from above and left feeling they had witnessed something essential. The building's public relations team cultivated this. They understood that the observation deck was the only part of the building that made money consistently, so they made it famous. They sent press releases. They invited photographers. They created events, races up the stairs, light shows, anniversary celebrations. They turned the building into a performance. In 1931, only about 20 tenants occupied the building, but 1 million tourists visited the observation deck. The tourists did not care that the building was empty. They cared that it was tall. They cared that they could see the city from a height no one had seen it before. They cared that they could tell people they had been to the top of the tallest building in the world. The observation deck revenue kept the building from total collapse in the early years. It did not make the building profitable, but it reduced the losses. $2 million per year was not enough to cover the mortgage, taxes, and operating costs, but it was enough to justify keeping the building open while waiting for office tenants who might never come. By 1936, the observation deck was crowded daily. Food and drink were available for purchase. Souvenir stands sold postcards, miniature replicas of the building, commemorative items. The observation deck had become a business unto itself, operating independently of the office space below. By 1944, the building had received its 5 millionth visitor. The building's fame created its own problems. The observation deck attracted people who came not to admire the view, but to end their lives. Between the building's opening and the mid-1940s, more than 30 people jumped from the observation deck or the upper floors. The number is disputed. Some sources claim fewer, others more, but the problem was real enough that management installed barriers and increased security. The barriers changed the experience. The original design allowed visitors to stand at the edge with nothing between them and the sky. The barriers added distance, safety, a reminder that this height was dangerous. The suicides reinforced the building's cultural presence. Each death was reported in newspapers. Each report reminded readers that the Empire State Building existed, that it was tall, that it was a place where things happened. The publicity was morbid, but it was publicity. The building stayed in the public consciousness. This was the building's survival strategy in the 1930s. Exist as spectacle. The offices were empty, but the observation deck was full. The building lost money on rent, but it made money on tourists. The structure itself was a failure by commercial real estate standards, but it was a success as an attraction, a landmark, a symbol. The managers understood this division. They stopped trying to compete with Rockefeller Center for corporate tenants and focused on making the building famous. On the morning of July 28, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr. was piloting a B-25 Mitchell bomber through heavy fog over Manhattan. He was trying to reach Newark Airport. Visibility was near zero. He was flying too low. At 9:40 a.m., the bomber struck the north side of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 79th floors. The impact tore a hole 18 feet wide and 20 feet tall in the building's exterior. The plane's fuel tanks exploded. Flames shot through the 78th and 79th floors. The 3 crew members aboard the bomber, Smith, Staff Sergeant Christopher Domitrovich, and Petty Officer Albert Perna, died instantly. 11 people inside the building died. 26 were injured. One of the plane's engines shot through the building and out the opposite side, falling onto a penthouse across 33rd Street and starting another fire. The other engine and part of the landing gear fell down an elevator shaft. Elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver was in the shaft at the time. The debris severed the elevator's cables. She fell 75 floors. The elevator's automatic braking system and the cushion of air compressed in the shaft below slowed the fall. She survived. Her injuries were severe but not fatal. The fall set a record, the longest survived elevator fall in history. The fires were contained within 40 minutes. The building's firefighting team responded immediately, joined by New York City Fire Department units. The limestone exterior and steel frame prevented the fire from spreading beyond the impact floors. The building absorbed the crash. The structural damage was significant but localized. The building did not collapse. This was 1945. The building was 14 years old. It had survived the Depression, survived years of vacancy, survived mockery and financial loss. Now it had survived a plane crash. The symbolism was obvious and nobody needed to say it. The building could withstand anything. The crash made international news. Photographs of the gaping hole in the building's facade appeared in newspapers across the country. The story reinforced the building's reputation. Not just tall but indestructible. The fact that the building remained standing after a direct hit from a bomber became part of its mythology. Repairs began immediately. The damaged floors were reconstructed. The hole was patched. Within months, the exterior was restored. The crash became another story in the building's accumulation of stories. Kong climbed it, a plane hit it, people jumped from it, tourists visited it. Each story added to the building's presence in public consciousness. But the crash also revealed something structural. 11 people died inside the building. Most of them were office workers on the 78th and 79th floors. By 1945, the building's occupancy had improved significantly. The war had brought tenants, government agencies, military contractors, organizations supporting the war effort. The floors that had been empty in the 1930s were occupied in the 1940s, which meant people were working there when the plane hit. The Catholic War Relief Services had offices on the 79th floor. 10 of the 11 people killed inside the building worked there. They were processing aid for war refugees. They were doing administrative work. They died because a pilot got lost in fog and flew into the building they happened to be working in that morning. The randomness was total. The 79th floor had been empty for most of the 1930s. If the crash had happened in 1935, those 11 people would not have died because they would not have been there. The building's vacancy had protected it from casualties. Its occupancy made casualties possible. This was not a meaningful observation in any practical sense. The crash was an accident. The timing was coincidental. But it illustrated something about the building's trajectory. It had spent years being too empty to be useful, and now it was occupied enough to be dangerous. The crash did not reduce occupancy. If anything, it reinforced confidence. The building had been hit by a bomber and remained standing. The fires had been contained. The repairs were swift. If anything could destroy the building, a direct hit from a military aircraft seemed likely. That had happened, and the building survived. By 1950, the building was nearing break-even occupancy. The crash was 5 years in the past. The war was over. The economy was recovering. The building that had been the empty State Building was becoming simply the Empire State Building, occupied, functional, profitable for the first time. But the crash left a marker: 11 people dead, 26 injured, one elevator operator who fell 75 floors and lived. These were not construction deaths. These were occupancy deaths. The building had killed people not during its construction, but during its use. The 5 construction workers who died building the structure received minimal public acknowledgement. Their deaths were noted in contractor logs, mentioned briefly in newspapers, then forgotten. The 11 people who died in the plane crash were memorialized. Their names were recorded. Their deaths were reported internationally. The difference was not in the deaths themselves, but in the narrative. Construction deaths were expected. Plane crash deaths were extraordinary. The building contained both kinds of death now, the expected and the extraordinary. The deaths that came from building it, and the deaths that came from using it. The structure itself was neutral. It did not care who died or why. It stood, and people worked inside it, and sometimes those people died, and the building continued. After the crash, the building installed additional safety measures. Fire suppression systems were upgraded. Emergency procedures were revised. The building became safer not because anyone had predicted a plane crash, but because a plane crash had happened and forced a response. This was the building's pattern. It adapted to disasters after they occurred. It did not anticipate problems. It responded to them. The construction deaths led to no systematic safety improvements during construction. Those would come later, in other buildings, after other deaths. The plane crash led to immediate upgrades. The difference was visibility. The construction deaths happened in public, but were ignored. The plane crash happened in public and could not be ignored. Betty Lou Oliver, the elevator operator who survived the 75-floor fall, the building that had lost money for nearly 20 years, became one of the most profitable pieces of real estate in New York. The observation deck continued to generate millions. Office space commanded premium rents. The broadcasting antenna on the mooring mast brought in additional revenue. The building worked, finally, the way it had been designed to work, except it had taken 2 decades and a world war to make that happen. The Mohawk ironworkers who built the frame did not share in the profits. They were paid $15 per day in 1930 and moved on when the work was done. Some died on other projects. Some returned to Conowake. Some settled in Brooklyn. By the 21st century, fewer than 100 Mohawk ironworkers still traveled to New York for work. The tradition was fading. The skyline they built remained. The 5 workers who died during construction, officially 5, possibly more, left no memorial in the building itself. Giuseppe Tedeschi, L. Demonici, 3 others whose names did not survive in accessible records. They died building a structure that took 20 years to become profitable and 90 years to become universally recognized. Their contribution was literal. They built it. Their compensation was $15 per day until they were killed. The building does not acknowledge them. The 11 people who died in the plane crash are better documented. The Catholic War Relief Services employees, Betty Lou Oliver, who survived, Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his crew who did not. Their deaths were extraordinary, which made them memorable. The construction deaths were ordinary, which made them forgettable. Al Smith died in October 1944, 7 years before the building became profitable. He spent the last 13 years of his life trying to fill a building that symbolized his own political decline. He had been governor 4 times, ran for president, and lost. Then he became the public face of a failed real estate investment. His office was on the 7th floor. Above him, mostly emptiness. He gave tours, made calls, placed advertisements. He never saw the building succeed. John Raskob died in October 1950, the year the building finally broke even. He had built it to outdo Walter Chrysler, to prove something about ambition and scale. He spent 20 years watching it lose money. He died before it became the financial success he had projected in 1927. The observation deck is still open. As of 2025, approximately 4 million people visit annually, paying significantly more than the original $1 admission. The revenue from tourism exceeds the revenue from office rent in some years. The building remains more valuable as spectacle than as workspace. In 2013, the building was incorporated into a real estate investment trust, Empire State Realty Trust, incorporated into the sub-anchor dated example for subsection 205. Financial statements are available. The observation deck generates over $100 million annually. Office space generates approximately $104 million. The broadcasting antenna generates $20 million. Retail space generates $9 million. The building is a business with multiple revenue streams, most of which did not exist when it was designed. The construction took 410 days. The profitability took 20 years. The fame took longer than both, but has lasted longer than either. The building is no longer the tallest in New York. It is currently the 8th tallest in the city, 10th in the United States, 59th in the world. But it remains the most photographed, the most filmed, the most visited. The question from the beginning remains unanswered. Was it worth it? The workers who died building it, not worth it. The investors who lost money for 2 decades, not worth it, until it was. The city of New York, which gained an international symbol, worth it. The tourists who pay to visit the observation deck, worth it. The tenants who work there now, functionally indifferent. Worth is not absolute. It depends on position, timing, survival. The building is worth different amounts to different people at different times, and those valuations do not reconcile. They coexist. The Empire State Building stands at 1,250 feet, 1,454 feet to the tip of the antenna. It contains 2 million square feet of space. It employs hundreds of people to maintain it. It attracts millions of visitors. It generates hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. It is a success by every contemporary metric. But it was built by men who did not share in that success. It was financed by men who did not live to see it. It was designed for a future that did not arrive on schedule. It survived not because it was well planned, but because the institutions holding its debt could not afford to let it fail. The building is limestone, steel, concrete, glass. It is also debt, labor, mortality, publicity, time. It is a structure and a system. It worked as a structure immediately. It took decades to work as a system. In the end, the building contains all of it: the ambition, the deaths, the miscalculation, the survival. It is a monument to what happens when ego meets economics, when construction outpaces demand, when men build toward a future they will not see and cannot control. The building stands. That is the only certainty. It will stand longer than anyone who built it, longer than anyone who financed it, longer than anyone who died building it or died inside it. The structure is indifferent to all of that. It is 1,250 feet of indifference, designed to house commerce, actually housing memory, still standing, still occupied, still famous, still here. Whether that is enough depends on who you ask, and when you ask them, and whether they are standing at the top looking down, or at the bottom looking up, or somewhere in between where most of the floors are, where people work and do not think about the height or the history or the cost. The building does not answer questions. It stands. That is what it was built to do, and it continues. It was expensive. Many merchants simply closed and walked away. In protest, the Radio Row merchants carried a coffin through the streets, symbolizing the death of Mr. Small Businessman. The media covered the march. It changed nothing. By the end of 1966, Radio Row was gone. The Port Authority demolished 164 buildings to clear the 16-acre site. Monica Rodriguez-Smith was 7 months pregnant when she died in the 1993 bombing. Her son, born posthumously by emergency cesarean section, survived for 4 hours before dying. Their names are on the memorial together. 2 lives counted as 2 deaths, though one never drew breath outside a dying body. John DiGiovanni was eating lunch in the underground cafeteria when the bomb exploded. He was a dental products salesman, 45 years old, married with 2 children. His body was recovered from the rubble. His name became part of the granite fountain installed in 1996 on the plaza above the blast site. When the towers fell in 2001, the fountain was destroyed. A fragment bearing part of his name, John D., was recovered and incorporated into a temporary memorial. His name appears twice now in the permanent memorial, once for 1993, once on the fountain fragment that survived the second attack. Stephen Knapp was a Port Authority maintenance worker checking equipment in the garage when the bomb went off. He was 51, a Vietnam veteran. His son later said that Knapp had worried about security in the garage, had mentioned that anyone could drive in without inspection. After the bombing, the Port Authority installed barriers and checkpoints. The improvements did not help Knapp, who was already dead. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 bombing, is serving life in prison at ADX Florence, a supermax facility in Colorado. He shares the prison with other terrorists, cartel leaders, and spies. He will never be released. His uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, helped plan the September 11th attacks. Mohammed is detained at Guantanamo Bay, awaiting a trial that has been postponed repeatedly for over 20 years. The legal proceedings have cost hundreds of millions of dollars and produced no final verdict. Larry Silverstein signed the 98 nine-year lease on July 24, 2001. 49 days later, the buildings were destroyed. He has spent the subsequent years rebuilding, negotiating with insurers, managing the relationship with the Port Authority, and defending against accusations that he profited from tragedy. By 2025, he was 94 years old, still involved in the site's development, still trying to complete a project that was supposed to be routine real estate management, but became the defining work of his life. George Slay worked as a court officer. He survived the 1993 bombing and returned to work in the towers. On September 11, 2001, he helped evacuate people from the North Tower, guiding them to stairwells. He was last seen on the 27th floor, directing people downward. His body was never recovered. His name is on the memorial. His family spent years hoping for remains to bury. None were ever identified. Michael Richards was a sculptor working in his studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower. He was an artist exploring themes of flight and African American history. His studio was in the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council's Artist Workspace program, which provided subsidized space to artists in the towers. American Airlines Flight 11 struck the 93rd floor at 8:46 a.m. Richards was likely killed instantly. His artwork was destroyed. A retrospective exhibition of his surviving work was organized years later. Critics noted the tragic irony: an artist exploring themes of flight killed by an airplane. Marcy Borders became known as the Dust Lady after a photograph showed her covered in gray dust, walking away from the towers in shock. She worked for Bank of America on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She escaped down the stairs, emerging into the dust cloud. The photograph, taken by a photojournalist, was published worldwide. Borders struggled afterward with depression and substance abuse. She said the photograph haunted her, that people recognized her on the street and asked her to recount her experience. She died in 2015 from stomach cancer, which her family believed was related to dust exposure. She was 42. William Rodriguez was a maintenance worker in the North Tower. He had keys to stairwells and helped people evacuate. He claimed he heard explosions in the basement before the plane hit, a claim that has been cited by conspiracy theorists as evidence of controlled demolition. Structural engineers have explained that jet fuel cascading down elevator shafts could have caused explosions in the basement. Rodriguez has made a career of speaking about his experience, appearing at conferences and in documentaries. His testimony illustrates how trauma, memory, and meaning become tangled. What did he hear? What does he remember hearing? What does he believe he heard? And what do others want him to have heard? The jumpers, people who fell or leaped from the towers, remain the most contested images of 9/11. Newspapers published photographs of people falling, then stopped publishing them after public outrage. Families of victims objected to their loved ones' deaths being displayed. Others argued the images documented reality and should not be suppressed. The photographs exist in archives, accessible but rarely shown. Their existence raises questions about what can be looked at, what should be remembered, and whose decision it is to make those determinations. Father Michel Judge, a Franciscan friar and chaplain to the New York Fire Department, was killed by falling debris while giving last rites to a firefighter in the North Tower lobby. A famous photograph shows firefighters carrying his body from the building. He was officially recorded as victim number 1, the first certified death of the attacks. He was 68 years old, openly gay within the fire department community, though closeted publicly, and beloved by the firefighters he served. His funeral was held at St. Francis of Assisi Church. Former President Bill Clinton attended. By 2025, more people had died from 9/11-related illnesses than died in the attacks themselves. The number continues to grow. Every few months, another first responder dies of cancer or respiratory failure linked to ground zero exposure. Their names are added to a supplemental memorial. The attacks continue killing, slowly, incrementally, through cell mutations and scarred lung tissue. The boundary between the attack and its aftermath blurs. The towers fell in 10 seconds. The dying has taken decades. The street grid never came back. Before the towers, Greenwich Street ran through the site, connecting neighborhoods north and south. When the Port Authority assembled the 16-acre superblock in the 1960s, it closed 5 streets permanently. The grid was interrupted. Tribeca to the north became separated from the financial district to the south. Pedestrians had to walk around the complex instead of through it. The towers created a dead zone for street life. A plaza that was windswept and empty, an underground mall that pulled people away from surface businesses. When planners redesigned the site after 2001, they promised to restore connectivity. Greenwich Street was rebuilt through the middle of the site, reopening in 2018. But the street now runs between memorial fountains and office towers, flanked by security barriers and surveillance cameras. It is not the same as the street that existed before 1966. That street was narrow, crooked, lined with small buildings. The new street is wide, straight, monumental. It connects north to south, but it does not restore what was erased. Radio Row cannot be rebuilt because the people who ran those businesses are mostly dead or retired. The electronics industry that supported the neighborhood has changed entirely. Vacuum tubes and transistor radios are obsolete. The components that Radio Row merchants sold can now be ordered online for next-day delivery. The expertise that was concentrated in those 9 blocks, the knowledge of which capacitor fit which circuit, where to find a replacement part for a 1940s radio, has dissipated or moved elsewhere. Even if someone constructed replica storefronts and hired actors to haggle over prices, it would be a museum exhibit, not a functioning neighborhood. The towers themselves cannot be rebuilt because they were never economically sustainable. They required subsidies for 28 years to maintain occupancy. The real estate market has changed. Companies need less office space. Remote work has reduced demand. Building 2 identical 110-story towers in 2025 would result in decades of vacancies, just as the original towers did. The architecture that seemed futuristic in 1973 now seems outdated: narrow windows, boxy floor plans, inefficient energy systems. One World Trade Center incorporates green building standards, advanced HVAC systems, and floor-to-ceiling windows. It is a better building by contemporary standards, even if it lacks the iconic simplicity of the Twin Towers. The skyline changed. For decades, the towers defined New York's profile. Tourists and residents oriented themselves by the towers. Pilots used them as visual landmarks. The towers appeared in thousands of films, photographs, paintings, and drawings. Their absence is a negative space, something missing that cannot be replaced by a different building in a different location. One World Trade Center is taller than either of the original towers, but it does not occupy the same psychological space. It is one building, not 2. It is symbolic rather than iconic. It represents resilience, which is not the same as presence. The dead cannot be brought back, which is obvious but bears repeating because so much of the memorial infrastructure seems designed to deny this fact. The museum preserves artifacts. The pools memorialize names. The phrase, "never forget," appears on bumper stickers, T-shirts, social media posts. But memory is not resurrection. Names engraved in bronze are not people. The museum's collection of personal effects, wallets, shoes, eyeglasses, are remnants, not replacements. The distinction matters because conflating memory with presence allows people to believe something has been restored when all that has been created is a different kind of absence. The sense of invulnerability that existed before 9/11 cannot be restored because vulnerability, once recognized, cannot be unrecognized. Before the attacks, Americans largely believed that foreign wars happened elsewhere. Terrorism was something that occurred in other countries. The homeland was secure. The attacks shattered that assumption. The response: 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the expansion of surveillance, the normalization of security theater at airports, did not restore the previous sense of safety. Instead, it institutionalized the recognition of threat. The money spent, over $8 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to the Costs of War project at Brown University, cannot be unspent. The lives lost in those wars, over 7,000 American service members, over 300,000 civilians in the war zones, cannot be unlived. The causal chain runs from the towers to those wars, though not in a straight line. The attacks were used to justify military action that might have been pursued regardless. The towers became a justification, a rallying cry, a blank check. Whether the wars would have happened without 9/11 is unknowable, but they certainly happened with it. The narrative that formed around the towers, the story of heroism, resilience, and unity, cannot be complicated without accusations of disrespect. To note that the towers were built by displacing poor communities, that they never turned a profit, that they represented a specific vision of urban development that prioritized monumental architecture over human-scaled neighborhoods, is to risk being accused of politicizing tragedy. But the towers were always political. They were conceived as economic instruments. They were built using government power to override local opposition. They operated at a loss subsidized by public funds. Treating them as purely symbolic erases the material realities that brought them into existence and kept them standing for 28 years. The Port Authority learned to build more fire-resistant buildings. Engineers developed better models for understanding how structures fail under extreme stress. Building codes changed to require more stairwells, better fireproofing, improved communication systems. These are real improvements. They will save lives in future buildings, but they do not address the deeper question. Should buildings this tall be built at all? The towers were experiments in vertical urbanism. The experiment failed twice, once economically, once catastrophically. The lesson drawn was how to build taller buildings more safely, not whether to build them. The question of what could have been done differently has many answers, none satisfying. Better intelligence coordination might have prevented the hijackers from boarding planes. Reinforced cockpit doors might have prevented hijacking. Different foreign policy decisions over decades might have prevented the formation of groups motivated to attack American targets. But tracing causality backward leads to infinite regress. Every event has precursors. Every decision forecloses other possibilities. The towers were built. They stood. They fell. Everything after that is response, not restoration. What remains is ground zero, a phrase, a location, a concept. The site continues to function as contested territory. Developers want office space. Families want memorial space. Transit authorities want infrastructure. Each group has legitimate claims. The result is compromise, some of each, none fully realized. The site will never be finished because finishing would require agreeing on what it should be, and no such agreement exists. It is a permanent construction site, a permanent memorial, a permanent argument about what was lost and what should replace it. The towers are gone. Nothing built in their place will bring them back. This is the fact that all the construction, all the memorials, all the ceremonies cannot change. The site where they stood is now something else. It will continue to be something else for as long as buildings stand there. The question is not what to build. The question is what to do with the absence.